All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Kamal. I'm a researcher social at the African Leadership Center, based in London, but also here. It is my utmost pleasure to welcome you this evening to our event. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm just doing a preliminary welcome. Our director, unfortunately, is not around, but I will pass on to her where she will have the welcome remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adeoti. I hope you can all hear me well in the room. And those online, a very warm welcome to you all. As Adeoti has introduced, my name is Shuvai Nyoni, and I'm the Executive Director of the African Leadership Center. I sincerely apologize that I'm not able to be with you in person in Nairobi, because I was very excited about the possibility of this conversation, but unfortunately, other things have kept me here in London, where we are also based at King's College London. So I'm still at the ALC, just in a different location. It really is my pleasure to welcome you all this evening, this afternoon, from wherever you're joining us. And really sincerely thank you for joining us. We are excited about this collaboration with the Nordic Africa Institute, and especially to have the opportunity, the pleasure, the treat really to host Dr. Angela Muvumba-Sellström, who is a friend, a comrade, a fellow sojourner in various areas relating to peace and security, and to have the opportunity to listen to her, to learn from her, and to drink of the deep wells that are Dr. Angela. And I know she's spent a couple of weeks or some, a short time with us in Nairobi visiting while she's undertaking her research. And it really has been a pleasure to host her. And we look forward to this being one of very many visits and also collaborations with yourself, Dr. Angela, but also with the Nordic Africa Institute, which I know has some history with the African Leadership Center. We're also very excited to have this evening Professor Paul Kamal, who is the director at the Institute for Development Studies at University of Nairobi. As many of you might know, the University of Nairobi, and especially IDS, a co-parent, if you will, of the African Leadership Center together with King's College London. We are a trust, an educational trust of King's College London and the University of Nairobi, and our academic home at the University of Nairobi is the Institute for Development Studies. Professor Kamal, as well, in his individual capacity, but also representing IDS, is a collaborator, a great collaborator, friend, brother, comrade of the ALC. And thank you so much, Prof. Kamal, for being with us this evening. And thank you also for responding at very short notice, but really accommodating us and being with us. And we look forward to hearing from you later as the event progresses. Very excitingly as well, we have with us Dr. Njoki Wamai, who she has quite a long profile. She does very many things and is involved in and leads very many things. But I think, and I will read her bio in a short moment, but I think what is very exciting for us is that she is an alumnus of the African Leadership Center, having gone through 2 of our fellowship programs before she went on to do her PhD at Cambridge. And so we are very delighted to have Dr. Njoki Wamai, who will be the moderator this evening. The only other thing I would like to say, just by way of welcome, is that this conversation comes at a very critical time, and it's important for us to, as a community, to reflect on the topic that is for discussion this evening. We all can attest to the fact that our world looks extremely different from what we have been accustomed to the last period, and the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, I think, since COVID, have really thrown many things into upheaval. And so it is a great opportunity, together with partners from the global north to be able to discuss, pathways for the future and really pathways for how we and think through alternatives or responses for some of the questions that confront us. For instance, in this instance, reform of the UN Security Council. I will now and I won't speak too much about the topic. It's not my place, but I will just like to introduce Njoki Wamai before I hand over to her, and allow her to take us through the rest of the evening. Dr. Njoki Wamai currently is an assistant professor in politics and international relations at USIU Africa in Kenya. She's also an IOMSO fellow at Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies and a visiting lecturer at the Universitat JOM in Spain, where she teaches on gender and peace studies. Njoki has written numerous articles, chapters, working papers on women, peace and security, transitional justice, gender justice and transitions, Kenyan politics, and the International Criminal Court. She previously was a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Governance and Human Rights at the University of Cambridge, and where she also attained her PhD as a Gates Cambridge Scholar. She is an alumnus of the African Leadership Center, having been a fellow on the Women, Peace and Security Fellowship and a Peace Development Scholar with the ALC at King's College, London. Njoki, of course, does many other things, wears very many hats, is also an activist, and is also stands for the cause of people and is a human rights defender. And I think that's important to note as we come towards the end of the 16 days of activism on violence against women that we've been commemorating. So Njoki, with that, I hand over back to you and say once again, Karibuni Sana, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I would want to introduce our speaker for today. So, and I think you're all aware in September this year, September 2024. September 2024, we had the UN, of course, General Assembly adopting a new agreement or a pact for countries for new ways of doing multilateralism, which is based on 7 areas from peace and security, and that's what we're talking about today, especially the UN Security Council reform, sustainable development, climate change, digital cooperation, human rights, youth and future issues, and transformation of global governance. Very important issue that this is move forward. So we could not have gotten a better person to especially come and discuss with us the pact, the thematic area in this pact number 1, peace and security. And one of the issues within the peace and security theme is the reform of the UN Security Council. So we are very, very lucky to have Dr. Angela Muvumba Celestron, because Angela has been researching for a very, very long time this area of UN Security Council, and especially focusing on its elected member states. So she has contributed first. Dr. Angela Muvumba Celestron is a senior researcher at the Nordic African Institute based in Uppsala in Sweden. She's also our visiting scholar here at the African Leadership Center. She's also my fellow board member. Actually, you are the OG in our board at the LPI. That's the Life and Peace Institute, and I'm so glad to see her in Sweden internationally for over 20 years, and of course in Sweden, Uppsala. In Uppsala, in Sweden, where she's based, she has served in the office of the chairperson of the African Union Commission in 2004, 2005, and while at Uppsala's University Department of Peace and Conflict Research, she has carried out multi-year research projects on conflict-related postgraduate course on gender, war, and peace. She has also been the director of the department's international training program in dialogue and again between 2018 to 2020 in cooperation with the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. Dr. Muvumba Celestron has been a member of the Swedish Women's Mediation Network, and she currently serves on the board of directors of the Institute and is an unresident fellow of the International Peace Institute, which is based in New York. So we could not have found a better, more qualified, more qualified, especially in terms of research and publications in this area, more than Angela. And Angela, I actually met you before I really met you. You know, I used to read your, and I think also, is it a code or something? I used to read and quote, then so when I met you, I was not even sure, is it the same person? But actually, her reputation precedes her. It tells me how a scholar, and I think one of the things I know about her, most comrades, is she's also very, very committed to certain, she's also an activist at heart. And I think it's important when you're also a scholar activist, because you do the right thing. You don't just do scholarship for scholarship's sake. And be grateful. So welcome, Dr. Muhomba Selstrom.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to the colleagues who are online and the friends, family, I am online. And it's really an enormous honor and privilege for me today. After that interview, I don't know if I can speak. I need a minute to compose myself.
I'll just begin by saying I'm very grateful to the African Leadership Center for hosting me in this visiting scholarship, visiting researchship. It's been a real pleasure to be here, to get to meet the colleagues here who organized this event in particular. I'm very grateful to Sebastian and to Nancy. They have done,
and of course, while I miss Shubai very much,
a great job, and of course, while I miss making this opportunity possible, and I look out into this group of people gathered here this evening. I see folks who have perhaps great concern about the state of peace on the continent and the nature of peace on the continent, the African continent. We are in a really difficult time. I agree, a very critical time, and sometimes very difficult, quite depressing time for the DRC, Sudan, for Somalia, Ethiopia. But of course, there's one way. It's very difficult to imagine the way out and the path forward. This presentation, this lecture is not meant to provide a template, meant to really help us get our hands around what is happening at the UN Security Council, what its prospects are for reform, and to try to engage a bit with the Nordic perspective and motivation, interest for Africa in becoming in finally having permanent representation on the Security Council. It's meant to really give us a little bit more structure and context. And I hope that I'm able to arm you a little bit with more information about this process that seems actually quite far away from the ongoing conflicts and challenges that we are witnessing and experiencing day to day. The talk that I'm giving has really three sort of specific things I'll touch upon. First, I will talk about the structural context of the Security Council, a little bit about the dynamics of the Council. We'll talk about the need for reform and Africa's underrepresentation. And then I will talk about some of the reform proposals, because there are actually multiple proposals kind of on the table. The most important. It's the only institution in the UN, according to the UN Charter, that can make binding resolutions and impose on UN member states or authorize the use of force. The General Assembly, where all members of the UN sit, may only make recommendations, essentially. Second, every state, regardless of its size or its might, needs such a body. Big states like the US, like Russia, use the Council to respond to disinformation, to expose one another to violations, to have dialogue and discussion where they may not be able to in other circumstances. Middle powers such as Germany or Japan or even South Africa need the Council in order to address collective threats and to have burden sharing and to resolve disputes, and most importantly, to avoid being caught between the big powers. And small and micro states, which I would argue are, I mean, the Nordic countries, most of them are not considered micro states, but small states and African countries would fit into that category. I could talk more about what a small state actually is. They need the Security Council to impose a rule-based international order. And this is really important because otherwise, with their small militaries and their limited resources, they really are forced, when the council is inactive and ineffective, to join other groupings of states to protect their own interests. So they're forced to join different coalitions, different organizations, and to spread their resources across multiple alliances. So just for the sake of coherence in the international system, a viable and effective Security Council is important. And when you look up or you listen to discussions about the Security Council, the state of the council itself is quite abysmal and dismal. The words that I have seen referring to the council include dysfunctional, hopeless, irrelevant. And it was established in 1945 in order to maintain international peace and security. And yet it has been unable to address some of the most important peace and security challenges of our time. Its composition has been one of the reasons that folks will argue that it's ineffective. It's got the 5 permanent members, and I'm sorry, I will rehearse this a little bit for you. I know many of you already know this information, but for the sake of my flow, let me say, 5 permanent members with veto power: China, France, the UK, Russia, and the United States. And then 10 rotating non-permanent members who are otherwise called the elected 10. And these elected 10 are nominated and appointed for 2-year non-consecutive terms. So that's very important to remember. The countries that get elected to the council frequently usually have a 20-year span between their terms when they're elected. So the only there are some exceptions now. South Africa, for example, has served on the council quite frequently since the end of apartheid. So its, I think, time span is between 10 and 15 years. I'm not sure, maybe 10 years is more like it. In 1945, the 15-member council represented 27% of the UN's membership. Today, it represents 0.08% of the 193 member countries. Africa, Latin America, and South Asia have never and do not have permanent representation on council. So that's one aspect, the representation. The other is the fact that the P5 have the veto power. And many would argue that the veto is really the crux of the problem, because they're able to stop and scupper any kind of resolutions or outcomes that are against their interests. And when we look at the veto record, you can see that there is some variation amongst the states, the permanent 5, in terms of how they've used the veto. I'll start with the least offending vetoing state, France. France has vetoed about 18 times. And since the end of the Cold War, never. It has not used its veto power. The UK, 32, China, 20, the US, 90, and Russia, 155. Now, let's not be kind of naive. The Chinese lack of a veto vote, or not using the veto vote on council, And that is a kind of incentive for states not to propose resolutions that they know will be vetoed by one of the P5. So China, for example, it's arguable, but it's possible that they are more likely to use a hidden veto, to threaten to veto, rather than to actually have a veto vote. And what has all of this meant? What has it meant in terms of action? Well, for example, the Council's traditional role as a kind of forum for the P5 has weakened significantly. States just intentionally and increasingly pursue their own security aims through other forums, such as NATO or the BRICS, and the global public itself has become completely uninterested in the outcomes of the Security Council. So the performance of the Council and its legitimacy have declined, and I know that many will say, particularly since Russia invaded Ukraine, but I think that the decline has been rather much more ongoing. It's been since well before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but the invasion of Ukraine kind of has been a kind of capstone, a heightened level. I mean, for example, only 2 missions have been authorized by peacekeepers are increasingly at risk of being attacked while on mission. These are signals that the Council has really lost its legitimacy over time. And it's, of course, we know it's both sides. So Russia has vetoed actions against its invasion in the Ukraine, and the US has blocked efforts to stop the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Then there are the procedural problems. So there's a concept called pen holdership, which is an informal process whereby a country has the pen for a conflict situation or thematic issue before the Council. The P3 states, the UK, France, and the United States, almost always dominate the pen holdership system. And this is particularly troubling given the fact that since the end of the Cold War, almost, between 50 to 60% of all matters before the Council, parameters of the Security Council. This doesn't mean, though, of course, that the elected states, the E10, and as you know, that's my personal pet project, the role of the elected 10. That doesn't mean that because they don't have veto power or because they are locked out of certain procedures that they are incapable of affecting actions. Non-permanent member states have been very active. They provide the majority of the troops to peacekeeping operations. They chair important committees. They have developed innovative, truly innovative mechanisms for making the Council more transparent, more accountable, and more engaged in human security issues. On the women, peace, and security agenda alone, elected member states have been really pivotal. Namibia, an elected member state in 2000, was the state that actually had the first open session on women, peace, and security. All the Nordic countries, together with African states, have continuously championed WPS. They have also introduced other thematic issues like climate change, child protection, human rights issues, health. All of these other sort of more human security related issues are really drawn out and advanced and promoted by elected member states. They do innovative things. So, for example, with the WPS thematic area, elected member states are the ones that really brought in civil society to brief the UN Security Council on WPS. They have been pivotal in making representation and briefings to the Council more gender balanced. They have pushed the UN Secretariat to report on women and peace and security issues. And they have also been very, very active in terms of promoting accountability, transparency, and development of better working methods. So that is the Security Council kind of context and background. What is it that Africa wants in terms of its representation on the Security Council when it deliberates on African conflicts and crisis? However, getting the as we need consensus to the African common position passed is really fraught. For example, who would be the two permanent African seat holders? And there's not always been complete consensus between African member states. They haven't always coordinated and maintained their consensus. During the 2011 Libyan intervention, they did not coordinate effectively enough with the African Union Commission. Many of them voted in an interest. Some scholars have said that France had an outsized role in influencing African states to vote for Resolution 1973 authorizing the NATO action. Civil society has been critical of African claims and demands for permanent representation. I mean, if we just go beyond the fairness and the equity of it, the other underlying question is, will African permanent representation really make the Security Council a better institution? Will it become more effective because African states are sitting there permanently? And in order to answer that, one can look at past practice of elected member states of the A3, 3 rotating African seats every 2 years that are on the council. They have been criticized for not always voting together. They vote together about 51% of the time. This is in contrast to, if a Nordic country is on the council, it always votes with France because it always votes with the EU position. No, I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I'm just saying that the level of discipline around voting is very important to consider. They have also not been really championing accountability processes in the same way, to the extent that civil society would like. They have taken a backseat sometimes, rather leveraging relationships with resource hurdles. So it's in my view, it's difficult to imagine that African permanent membership will do anything more. And this isn't a small thing. I think it's enough to have African permanent membership because of the principle of fairness and equity. But I don't think we should kid ourselves and assume that permanent membership will mean that the council will be a better council because African countries are sitting there permanently. In fact, I think what we know from research and both big middle powers and also small states when they get onto the council, but particularly middle powers like India, South Africa, Brazil, is that they're actually much more likely to pursue their own national interest. And so I think that that's important. So what are the proposals for UN Security Council reform? There are many proposals. It's not a done deal by any means after the Pact for the Future. There's the G4 proposal, which is a proposal from Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil. And this calls for 6 permanent members, new permanent seats, including 2 for Africa, as well as expansion of non-permanent seats. And what's interesting with the G4 proposal is that they don't propose to give the veto power to the new permanent members, but they do propose to have a 15-year review of veto power for new permanent members. They seek to kind of balance the desire for reform, the demand for it, with the kind of realpolitik constraints that the P5 would not really embrace expansion of the council, and certainly not to give permanent membership to new members. Then there's the Uniting for Consensus group, which takes a completely different approach. It's comprised of countries that actually want to balance and counterbalance the G4. So it's countries like Italy, Pakistan, and Argentina. That should tell you something if you think that the G4 is Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil. And these countries actually don't propose any new permanent seats. They argue that permanent seats will just perpetuate inequality. They advocate for an expansion of non-permanent seats with longer terms and renewable terms. So that's a big difference. And that would allow more flexibility. They contend that permanent membership would just entrench hierarchies within the Security Council. And I would think that this kind of proposal actually is particularly attractive to the Nordic countries because it's towards inclusivity, accountability, adaptability. But it's on paper and it's repeatedly stated that the Nordic countries support African permanent membership on the Security Council. So that means that Nordic countries don't fall into the Uniting for Peace proposal as well. And then, of course, there's the African common position, which I've already mentioned to you. One concern about the future negotiations will be, of course, that the permanent seats for Africa will end up in what was said by some ambassadors in New York, a devastating internecine competition for the 2 seats. Because aside from South Africa and Nigeria, several other African countries would be well positioned to argue that they should have one of those seats. And think of Egypt, Kenya, even Rwanda, which has a large percentage of proportion of contributions to peacekeeping operations. Ethiopia would be another one. So these are the proposals. What have the Nordic countries said? Well, they have, as I said, they've championed principles of inclusivity and multilateralism, and they have really, particularly in their campaigning for election to the Security Council, continuously kind of promoted an African position in terms of representation. They've argued that in order for the council to be much more effective and much more legitimate, it should look like the rest of the world. So Sweden has been vocal about addressing historical imbalances. Norway has supported voluntary veto restraint in cases of mass atrocities. Denmark has highlighted the importance of expanding non-permanent seats as well. Their positions have been quite nuanced and a little bit difficult to read, but all positions on reform of the Security Council are very nuanced and kind of difficult to read. The most clear position actually is the African position. And I recently spoke to someone who said Africa has been so actually disciplined about getting representation on council. And so it's telling that the P5 are now in agreement that Africa should have permanent representation, that all of these other proposals include African representation, and even the Uniting for Peace, which is against permanent representation, has actually made a concession. Well, but for Africa, it's important that Africa gets permanent representation. I'm kind of running out of time, so I want to kind of move forward because I think that the discussion will be very, very important. I want to just leave you with a few recommendations, or rather considerations. The Pact for the Future has text in it calling for continued discussion and accelerated discussion about reform of the UN Security Council. And those discussions are to take place in an intergovernmental negotiation process. There was an informal working group meeting just in November on this question. So it's a question that is alive and moving forward, but still quite fuzzy, because these different positions I've outlined for you, all of them they all have real benefits and trade-offs, and different groups of states are uncomfortable with different aspects of each proposal. How will reform actually happen? Well, eventually, if it ever gets to a text-based negotiation and a text is agreed to, then there would have to be a vote of 2/3 of the UN General Assembly agreeing to the reform, accepting the reform, and then ratification. And most importantly, this would have to happen without any veto from any of the P5. So for many folks, myself included, discussion about reform of the Security Council can appear to be sort of just a pipe dream, that we're dreaming about this. But there has really been movement in the last few years. I think that many countries are frustrated with a lack of effectiveness of the Security Council, and also alive to the fact that that it's an incredible contrary situation to have an institution that has this little representation and reflection of the world. So I think that there will be movement, and I do think that there will be some kind of eventual compromise around different aspects. And I think there will be three kind of areas that they will have to come down to agreeing upon. The first will be around how to decide who should have the permanent representation. And I think that there are many ways that permanent representation can be kind of bolstered. It can be bolstered with giving permanent seats, say 6, to countries without veto power. So 2 for Africa, 1 for Latin America, 1 for South Asia, 1 for the Middle East, and perhaps 1 for the G4, so that Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil have to share. Then you could include more non-permanent states. And finally, complement this by perhaps giving a seat each to a regional organization, to the AU, to the EU, to ASEAN, to NATO, to OAS. I'm just kind of riffing here, but the idea would be that you would actually be a bit more creative in terms of how to address these regional imbalances and improve global representation. The second thorny issue is reforming the veto. It's clear that a phased approach will be the way forward. We have now this Lithuania veto resolution, which restricts usage of the veto, and it really requires veto when a country uses a veto. They're required now to explain their veto vote to the General Assembly. I think that kind of mechanism is a good step forward, and I think that there'll be other kind of mechanisms that can be established. So one idea is to have a collective veto system where vetoes have to be with 3 P5 members before they can take effect. Another is to do something where you phase out the veto power. And then you could also have some kind of other system where you have other oversight groups and a regional bloc or non-permanent member group that also has a veto. And then lastly, enhancing transparency and accountability. There are so many ideas that are floating around about this, and there's everything from mandating live streaming with closed debates. Voting records are already public and available. But we could require written justification of veto usage, that they be debated in the General Assembly. We could require online portal for real-time updates. And then, of course, we could go further with giving the General Assembly, and I think there are many states that are in favor of this, giving the General Assembly greater oversight of the UN Security Council, and enabling it to actually override veto resolutions with a 2/3 majority. So in conclusion, the paths ahead are very uncertain, but they are certainly ripe with potential. They will be only met and traversed through real collaboration with states that need a functioning Security Council. And my argument here has been that African countries and Nordic states jointly need a strong Security Council for the 21st century. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. I think this is the first time I've had a proper framework of how we can reform the UN from Africa. We are always in this meeting within ourselves saying the UN must reform, but you never said how. Thank you. So thank you so much for this insight, Angela. I think now I have clarity. All of us here, I believe this is was so insightful. So without further ado, I want to introduce our discussant. I think we should reflect. Who's reflecting on Dr. Angela's presentation. And our discussant, we are very, very lucky to have Professor Paul Kamal, who we fondly refer as PK. So Professor Paul Kamal is also part of the ANC through the partnership we have with the University of Nairobi. So we work together, and we are very happy to have our partner here. So then he's also the Director of Research and Associate Research Professor at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. He holds a PhD in Development Studies, an MSc in Economics from Zimbabwe. I know there are many Zimbabweans in the house. And a BA in Economics from the University of Nairobi, and he teaches and conducts research in areas of development economics, human security, political economy, regional integration and trade, and the informal sector and human development. He has supervised many people, including 7 PhDs and 40 postgraduates, and he's written widely on textiles, clothing, industrial development, Chinese ascendancy in Africa, focusing especially on trade, investment, and migration, and unemployment and development issues, state business relations. But currently is involved in several research projects at IDS. If you've used Afro, how many of you have used Afrobarometer data? So this is the man in charge of Afrobarometer in Kenya and the surveys, which is very useful, and we're very grateful for that, because that data has been so useful. So please use Afrobarometer data if you're not using it. We have to keep, we're already doing research and surveys. So Afrobarometer surveys is in charge of the Afrobarometer surveys in Kenya, women and leadership in institutions of higher education, and access to justice among the poor, waste management, decentralization, citizen engagement, service delivery, devolution and service delivery, and the contribution of the non-profit sector on youth employment in Africa. He also deals with issues of human capital development, and is the team leader of the World Economic Forum. Wow, we need to take a break. Global Competitiveness Report in Kenya. He's also the country director for the International Development Program, that is a collaboration program, a master's, between the University of Nairobi and Radboud University in Netherlands. So please welcome our discussant, Professor Paul Kamal.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that elaborate and very humbling introduction. I'm truly humbled to be here this evening. Good evening, colleagues in the house. Good evening. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon for our online participants who could be joining us from various parts of this globe. It's really humbling opportunity for me to be here and to give a rejoinder to such an elaborate and very mind-boggling and insightful presentation by Dr. Angela. When I want to take this opportunity also to thank ALC under the leadership of Shubai. I'm glad to meet you and Dr. here. We did some work together on higher education and women leadership. But we did this a lot during the COVID, so we never got to meet except through computers. I'm not new to ALC because we've had partnership for a long time. In fact, one of the executive directors, Dr. Godwin Murunga, remains my colleague in IBS. So we have, again, with ALC in partnering, ALC partnering to implement a program or unit within our Master of Development Studies on peace, security, and development. So when Shubai and ALC approached me, and I looked at the topic on UN Council, as you heard, one of the greenest person in terms of understanding matters of security, and especially at that high level of UN Security Council. But nonetheless, Nancy was there with Chumai saying, you have to come and just give a rejoinder. So I said, I'll come. I asked, what are we presenting about? I was told, you listen and discuss. So I'm getting these facts just like any other participants, and therefore this task will be for all of us. I don't know why ALC chose me, but I said I'll still come. When I was getting my way from the university, today being a Wednesday, I thought the traffic would be much easier, but it's like a Friday on Wednesday in Kenya because of tomorrow's holiday. So by that, I thought I would get here earlier, meet with Angela so that I can get further insight into this important topic of discussion to get points or gist of what to discuss on. But it appears the gods were not in my favor. I got stuck in traffic between State House and Kilimani, and they have only arrived here in time. Actually, we started like, let me say on time. We got here at 15:37. So I say, again, I'm here, 17:07. I said, I'm here, not knowing what to say, but we can all agree that in spite of where we are coming from, our background, our experience, matters of security, both in our community, in our country, in our continent, and the world at large, are issues of paramount importance. Everybody or every human being is concerned with security around them because it's the only way we can interact and navigate as human beings. It's also a very critical developmental issue, and that's how I see myself coming into this discussion. That when we're talking of development, from an ideas perspective, as you've heard, I come from a background of economics, and then get into development studies, so I had to rerun or to restructure, transform my mind from thinking of modeling and statistics to start thinking and working on development. But generally, what is it about? It's about improving the well-being of the people. And there's no way this is going to happen without first providing an environment for all of us to do what we need to do for our daily operation and interaction. So then, I get to ask myself, since 1945, we have been told by Dr. Angela that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council have remained more or less the same, right? That time representing almost 10%, did you say? And 27% of the global population and or country representation. But now this has declined to about 0.7%.
0.7.
0.7%. 0.8%. So I look for the easier route at all times to get statistics because you can get away with a lot of things, just the data says, right? So what did I take from this? And I believe all of us have been quite educated from this presentation. Joki, who I hold very highly in her esteem because she's an expert in this area, says that she's also learned a lot. Joki and I have worked together for many years in matters of development. But what triggers my mind is that we have the 5 permanent members of the council with veto power, and then we have 10 who elected, 5 on permanent and the others on rotation. It is quite worrying that Africa has had minimal representation in this council. And therefore, I get back to say, what can we know about Africa? And I would like to draw from our Afrobarometer data. And for the Afrobarometer data that we have been carrying out from 1999, is that democracy has been on decline. We are seeing increasingly unconstitutional change of government in many African countries. It is also evident from data that Africa is the home to most, to a greater proportion of conflict. Way from 1960s when we got in, when many countries became independent. And therefore, if there was need for representation, it is in Africa. There's also from Afrobarometer data, the decline in upholding human rights in Africa. And that's a major challenge. Africa is a home to 1.4 billion people of the 7.6 billion people in the world. And this is the segment we say is unrepresented. When you look at all odds against development, be they poverty, participation in global trade, Africa remains quite low. When we talk of attraction of FDI, Africa only attracts about 6.5 to 7% of FDI, meaning that even for us to get power and capability to argue for our case, it might take longer. It is a home to 54 countries of the 193 countries in the world, and yet is unrepresented. So the presentation on the research by Dr. Angela points to very critical areas. One is that it is almost mandatory that UN Council, which was formed in 1945 with a view to stabilizing operation and country relationship so that we could avoid an occurrence of the Third World War, has not lived to its mandate because much of its operation have remained static, not moving with time and tide in terms of the need for reform. So it is true that the representation of the smaller or developing country has been very low, and even agitation for voice. But it's becoming more and more apparent that we need to rethink this model in order to bring two elements: representation, equity, and inclusivity. I'm very happy and pleased to learn today that the Nordic countries, which have remained one as a force, most of the time aligning to the France in terms of the veto, have come to the forefront of proposing for inclusive, and more important, to include or to bring African countries on board. There are several proposals, and I do not want to repeat this, but just to highlight a few, there's the Africa proposal, which calls for inclusion of Africa by 2 permanent position membership with veto and 5 rotational, right?
I think it's 3. It's okay. Right.
Yeah, no.
It's a lot.
I'm also maybe misusing statistics. We have there's also the proposal to have 6 new permanents. Yeah?
It's 5.
5. Yeah. It's to move with expanding permanent seats without veto and reserve 2 for Africa. There's also the expansion of non-permanent members with longer term, And there is United for Peace, which calls for better representation. It is quite worrying that we as a continent fail, first and foremost, to have a voice. It's worrying that only 51% of the resolutions taken, that the 5 African members have voted in one side, right? So it would even bring more problem if we are told, as a continent, can we identify who would take the 2 permanent position? And this calls for more education. I was hoping that we could get to know, when it was 1945, perhaps historical, how were these 5 permanent veto countries elected? Because I'm sure if it was today, I know the conflict between Japan and China in terms of the representation, and China invoking the veto so that to prevent Japan from getting to the membership, could have played part even more prominent. So that from where we start, perhaps we need to see a transformation of the UN security organ. In as much as important as it is, it will be the high time to review, and I like that particular point from your presentation, that we need to rethink the veto power, right? And one of the proposals is whether we can have the majority, so that even if you have veto, you cannot veto every decision, but you need to have alliance even within the veto member countries. So that is what you're calling the balance of veto power. We're talking of enhancing accountability because we have seen a lot of laxity, that even when conflicts are happening in some region, then the UN Council takes a lot of time to pronounce itself and even to intervene. Much more when we're talking of conflict in developing countries and in Africa in particular. We need to continue arguing for equity and inclusivity. Perhaps from an African point of view, the AU and other organs, it's the high time we started this conversation so that from onset, we can say who would be the best representative in this position came to us. And finally, they need to rethink these reforms. How can they be better within the pact that is now on the table, the Pact 2024 on UN reform? How prepared are we? Are we sure it's not going to cause more conflict among African countries? Because we have seen a lot of taking sides even within the conflict in the region. If we were to think of DRC, the Somalia conflict, we've all seen even African countries not forging a common front, perhaps because of the self-interest that many countries have. So I think just reforming at UN level may not give us the desired result, but we also need to reform within so that we can be more inclusive, we can be more accommodative, and stop looking at each other as a country different from the other, but more of an African representation. We should not stop this fight. In my view, and your paper is quite an eye-opener for all of us to start debating, researching, and engaging with this process of UN Security Council. And thank you very much, and congratulations, Dr. Angela, for this well-researched paper. I look forward to reading the report when it's ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamal, for bringing us the development perspective. Remember, these reports happened within the continent and also from the African perspective. And the reforms also we need to do on the continent on development. If we are going to get even to the level of demanding for us, we demand for these things. Thank you so much. You can see where we need interdisciplinarity, what an economist development person brings to international relations. So thank you. So I would now want to welcome the floor for your questions, comments, We're only going to have one session, and then we will have comments or final statements from our speakers. Okay. So please welcome, I can see Munya's hand is up. Anyone else? Is that Nancy?
Thank you for the presentation and for the insightful. My question is on we have already seen the challenges of Africa playing on the international scene when we look at when Africa was being admitted to the G20, having a seat at the G20, there is still a conversation on who represents Africa. AU, is it the AU chairperson, or is it the head of the secretary, or the commission chairperson, right? And with the way that the AU is structured and the revolving kind of seats, and how it's structured in the region, how do you envision if the Security Council gives us a block seat, right? I wanted to also hear, maybe you spoke about how Nordic countries can be quite an important ally in the issue because they are also smaller countries with smaller interests. But how would maybe the Africans lobby countries like the emerging powers, like the Middle East, UAE, Qatar, that seem to be holding a lot of influence, and whom, if we have on our side, we can probably have more gains. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna. Also to our online audience, please share your questions. Thank you for being here with us, team. I see you're quite a number. I just want you to feel that we are with you and we are very grateful for you. So please share your questions. Yes, Albert.
Yeah, thank you very much for the powerful presentation. Thank you, Jofi. I'll start with the keynote speaker, and it was very wonderful for the structure and also your recommendation. You have very powerful recommendation, but I want to ask a question. Do you think it's interesting just having, not even having permanent members, just having a kind of rotating members across the board? Is that a chance to just have rotating members in a way that will reflect this legal perspective of equality that the UN kind of proposed? And the second aspect, and this is another question, taking into consideration that all these international organizations or intergovernmental organizations, specifically the League of Nations and the UN, were respectively created as a result of the end of the First World War and the Second World War, right? Given that we are really going towards the Third World War, do you think this eventual Third World War will orchestrate another global organization, and this other global organization will come in with different power dynamics, and this power dynamics will have other winners of the world aggregating power to themselves? Don't you think, or let me ask you a question, because you are an expert in this particular field. This question is, what could be the most suitable approach to come up with a global organization that will serve collective interest instead of personal or individual interest that we've seen across the world after the Second World War, the First World War, and the Second World War? Those are my questions. Thank you very much. I congratulate you again for your powerful presentation. Thank you.
Do we have questions from the online audience? Online audience, feel free to share your question. So Dr. Adeote will read it for us.
Okay, thank you. So we have just two questions. The first one is, how does the Pact for the Future ensure the active inclusion of youth and women from grassroots organizations in shaping global governance reforms? And the second question is, what steps are being taken to ensure Africa secures permanent representation on the UN Security Council, and how can grassroots organizations, specifically Unity Bridge Africa, contribute to this effort? Thank you.
Thank you for that. There is one last question from,
Um,
please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Anthony Chege. Thank you for a very thoughtful and insightful presentation for both Professor and Dr. Angela. I think my question, just a few brief notes. One, to talk about the urgency for Africa, unity of purpose versus the proposals that are coming up. In terms of unity of purpose, we're thinking just the idea, there have been observers who suggest the idea of just deciding who goes into this permanent seat might end up dividing Africa even further. That has been what some of the others have thought of. But then again, we've been able to see A3+1, not to brag, most of it worked under when Kenya got into the election position. But we see A3+1 coming in, and they were able to kind of have a consensus in decision making that affected Africa and the Caribbean at large. So we've seen a situation or framework where they actors in the UNSC can be able to make decisions, have a consensus in certain matters. But unity of purpose within Africa as it stands in decision making, in terms of even adapting any of the proposals, become an issue that needs a bit, I think, further discussion. For instance, if we go with what the Nordic countries are able to say, you know what, let's have these 6 actors coming in, even if we believe that African countries should have this permanent seat. What about issues such as the economic setup, where every permanent member does about $100 million a year as a contribution? Imagine the diplomatic power that a country will require, representation across country, intelligence collection, security purposes, all these things that go into one being a permanent member. How do we consider these factors in terms of the proposals that have been put forward to determine which country goes in? And maybe the other issue, the final issue is, when the first determination was being made on the P5, we understand we just come out of the Second World War, the dynamics, real politics was a bit different. Now we find ourselves in a world seen as a multipolar world. How does that then affect how even the discussion and the idea on this P5 membership? Because BRICS are coming, new actors are coming in, even the issue of de-dollarization and many other factors in this multipolar kind of setup. How then does that affect even the proposals that are given towards the permanent seat? And also, how does then that affect even real politics in terms of deciding if we accept member X and he is aligned to these other new actors in the multipolar setup, does that affect how the P5 works? So the question was unity of action, unity of purpose for Africa in terms of looking through the lens of the proposals. And second, is this new multipolar world, how does that then factor into the new proposals on deciding a permanent member?
Thank you, Chege. Is there any last question before we end? Sudan, anything?
It's a comment. My voice,
For the recording, you did it.
thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's very useful. Actually, if you are following the news, a few days or a few weeks ago, there is something regarding Sudan Security Council. All the members, 14 out of 15, they agree with the decision coming from UK and Sierra Leone in terms of the protection of the civilians in our country. But only Russia used the veto, and then nothing happened. So all that efforts for diplomatic collapse, and still nothing happened for our people on the ground. Daily basis, hundreds or millions of people are suffering with the after gas. So my question is, there is any mechanism to reform or to make this proposal happens in the real, or even those 5 countries have veto rights? Because this world now is coming up for power. This case, even USD that we do to help Israel, this kind of issue. We will see this. So they show any kind of ability to change this. I think it is very difficult to just give us for other countries that if they lose that advantage for them. So this is the question.
Thank you, Mohammed. I will give the panelists 3 minutes each. I know You will try.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah,
Maybe.
because I don't think I have all the knowledge to be able to address, but thank you very much. And I want to agree with the issues that have been raised, that we need to rethink where these reforms are heading. And from where I start, it would be better to rethink the veto as the first stage of reforms, even before we come to expanding the membership. Because any effort to bring new permanent membership is likely to be vetoed. The second element that I would like to address is the question that my brother raised, that if we were given as Africa 2 seats, or they were not to be given, but if they were allowed through this pact, who would be best fitted for Africa? Is it a country? Is it the EU? Is it organization? Is it regional blocks? Because more increasingly, we don't see the countries coming to an agreement by this year. And that's what brings us back to the 1945 after the Second World War. How easy was it just to agree that led to the permanent, the 5 years? From an economic point of view, my second proposal would be to advance the agenda for non-permanent positions so that there will be more room for more countries, but expand the membership. If you look at other UN bodies, say for the trade, for the security, the reform of GATT to WTO took that cognizance where all member countries have equal voting right. Of course, it has made making decisions very difficult, and because this is like a club which can easily agree in a greenhouse and agree and make decisions for everybody in the world. So Africa needs to be more prepared. We need to discuss this more so that as a continent, we see how to increase our voice and representation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. 3 minutes. Wow. Okay. Some of the colleagues actually answered some of the questions in their own questions. So I won't overstate things. I think that the discussion about 1945, I think is it Anthony? I think a colleague there very aptly kind of hinted about the fact that there's, I think that the idea that you have these P5s is just a reflection of the victors of World War II. So there was no real, there were discussions in San Francisco, but also we should remember that the US was really, really active in leading the way towards establishing the Security Council and the UN, the new UN. And part of the idea was that by having these 5 victors as kind of sort of policemen of the world, that they would not enter into conflict with one another. And I think to some extent that has been very viable, or it's not been perfect, but it had some credence, particularly right after World War II. Then we had a lot of proxy wars in Africa and Asia, and so there was continued violence and insecurity anyway. But that's the idea. I think one observer I've known has said we should stop being naive about these intergovernmental organizations. In the multipolar world in particular, I think to come back to the question, I think we are just going to be witnessing further kind of duplication of intergovernmental processes, and also now coalitions, smaller coalitions of states, even on the African continent. Peacekeeping and peace enforcement has now kind of slipped away from the AU, and it is coalitions or groups of states actions and interventions. I think that that is also what's both worrying and also it reflects a reality of the world now, that there's wealth and power that's really diffuse. I have also heard some observers say that there will be, as you say, World War II, and then there will be a new organization. And that is the only way we'll get a new organization, through a massive, violent event that forces governments to rethink how they would like to organize themselves. I really hope not, because it will mean millions of people suffering even more, dying most likely, and it will be devastating for our environment and climate and a number of things, and the next generation. I think that is what the Pact for the Future was sort of trying to avoid, to get the member states of the UN to really begin thinking about how to come up with real proposals to avoid that and to address new threats that can lead to World War III, excuse me. So I think, but I do think that in a real sense that, for example, the Nordic countries will be much more. I mean, they have now all joined. They're all now part of NATO. They have strengthened their engagement in the EU. This is a big shift from before the Ukraine war. They have had to do that for their own security reasons. I mean, for their own sense of security and protection. And yet, I think that coalitions such as with the Nordic countries who can work within the EU and within NATO are very vital and important for Africa. And I think African states need to be pretty engaged in cultivating a number of different kind of pivotal coalitions globally and really take advantage of the multilateral landscape and how it's fragmented in order to push for their own interests. I think that is what has happened. I mean, of all the proposals for the Security Council reform, Africa's proposal is the only one that is sort of, everyone has kind of agreed to it. And some observers have actually said this is a real example of African states developing unity. And I agree with you. I didn't have a chance to talk about the A3+1. I think that's a very important outcome, the collaboration with the Caribbean states. And the kind of the political commitment together. I think that has been a very important signal. And I think these kinds of signals are important. I cannot take up any more time. I kind of devoted myself to this question. I don't think that there are too many more ways that we can kind of second guess what will happen with regards to which African countries would get a seat on the council or seats. I think it's possible for the AU to actually figure out how to do this. I think it will be difficult and complicated, but I mean, the Eswini consensus has been in existence since 2005. The push for reform of the Security Council and African representation, it's been an ongoing battle. I never thought we would even see the day where we would get to this stage. I do think that I have sort of a faith that discussion will be possible, and there will be possibly there'll be, an agreement that it will be rotating, long-term rotating. So the permanent seats can rotate between African states on a long-term basis. So 6 years for each state, and then they can be re-elected, or they can another country can take that seat for another 6 years. I do think that there will be a kind of tacit agreement that rather than wait for veto reform, that permanent membership is the kind of the entryway. But I agree with you that tactically, actually, veto reform is very crucial. But I think that the P5 will never agree to veto reform until we have a global cataclysm, which I hope we never have. We won't. And yes, I mean, I'm happy to talk to others about the other questions. For the online participants, I think that the Pact for the Future is actually very strong on gender, on youth and peace and security. A lot of the human security aspects and about inclusion in a number of ways it's very strong on that. And the upcoming peacebuilding review will also really have particular platforms for youth engagement. And so I think that there are very many options there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to both of you. And especially Angela, thank you for the keynote that you gave us. You, as I said, you gave us a pathway. In many ways, many of us were in this field of peace and security. We go everywhere, we are talking reform, but I think we've never clearly, so succinctly have it outlined. How can it happen? What are the proposals? So thank you for offering us that. And I think now we have something to work with. We're looking forward to that publication and also other policy publication, more especially, so that we can use it in our work. And also even for activists can use it, because many times, many activists, I believe many of the people also on our call do not have these tools and academics. And thank you very much, Professor Paul PK, for bringing, as I said, that development perspective. It's very enriching. I like what you told us about how the WTO was reformed and now the challenges that it's reformed from GATT. So also we know now the problems we're likely to find ourselves within the UN Security Council. So thank you for that. I now want to welcome Adeote to come and give us, please, I can hear some people are backing their backs. We are very warm here at the AFC. We don't let you go like that. You have to drink tea or have something to eat before you leave. Thank you very much, Adeote. So please, let's give another round of applause.
Wow, I think Dr. PK said it, Dr. Njoki has said it. I think, first of all, Dr. Angela, thank you so much for taking your time out to come and speak to us on what is indeed a timely topic. It's not new. I think, but now, so given where we are with the state of the world, the changing global order, I think it is very important to understand where Africa is in all of this, and also where's our, how are we exercising our own agency in these conversations. I think it's very important to look at all of that. I think thank you so much for the brief background, because we all know why the UN was created, but I think just really understanding the intricacies of it was very important. Thank you as well, Dr. Kamal, for your own contributions and coming to it from a different angle, as Dr. Njoki said. She has wrapped it up really well, so I don't think there's anything else I need to add. I just want to say thank you all for also joining us this evening, and for those of us online, we do apologize that we started late. But here we are. It was definitely an enriching conversation. And for those of us who are in the room with us, we'd like to invite you to join us for a reception. For those of us online, we will have some snacks on your behalf. And yeah, just want to thank everybody and have a lovely evening. And please, of course, keep in touch with the ALC, look out for our other events. The year is ending, but of course, from the new year, we will have other events happening. So thank you.
Thank you.